in the end, ejects Luther from the church. Well, when Luther hears about this excommunication, and especially the reasons for it, again, he just gets furious. He takes the papal bull, has the decency to go outside the city walls of Wittenberg, lights a bonfire, throws the papal bull onto the bonfire. So there he's basically said, okay, I've had it. I'm breaking with the church. I reject what the Pope has said. I don't recognize the excommunication, etc. Then Luther sits down to write some very important works, which he does in 1520. He writes 3 very important books, which are really the beginning of his major effort at forming a new church. They contain all his most important reforming ideas, and it just makes clear the break between Luther and the church. The 3 works he writes are Address to the Christian Nobility of the German Nation, On Christian Freedom, and On the Babylonian Captivity of the Church. And with these 3 works and the really revolutionary ideas Luther put in them, the Reformation has gotten its strong start. I'm not going to go through each work separately and tell you about each one of them because they're much too long and involved for that. But what I will do is just sum up some of the main ideas that Luther put forward in these works. First of all, we'll take a look at his, I guess you'd say, criticisms of the church and the papacy, and then we'll take a look at some of his more positive or constructive ideas. Well, perhaps the most important criticism of the church, or one of the most important, is Luther's rejection of transubstantiation, the miracle of the Mass, that occurrence, that miraculous occurrence where when the priest pronounces the words hoc est corpus meum, the bread and wine are miraculously transformed to the body and blood of Christ. Luther said, this transformation, this miraculous transformation, does not happen. Transubstantiation does not occur. And he's really saying this because he believes, as you'll see in a second, that priests have no power to make such a thing occur. However, Luther does not go as far as later reformers. He still believes that the actual body and blood of Christ is present in the Mass. This is what we call the real presence. It is in the Mass. It's just that there's no transformation. And here's how Luther sees it. This idea of Luther is called consubstantiation. The way Luther sees it, on the outside, the elements look like bread and wine, but their inner essence, which you can't really see or even really detect, is the body and blood of Christ. So they're both at the same time. And you have the real presence. And you have the re-sacrifice. So it's not really a total rejection of the Mass. It's just a rejection of the priest's power to bring off a miraculous transformation like transubstantiation. But of course, you can imagine how the church is going to react to that. Secondly, and as an extension of this first thing, Luther rejects the church's claim that the clergy has special powers, that they have semi-divine powers that enable them to pull off the miracle of the Mass, that they are different from other people, that they have these special abilities. And Luther just says they don't. They don't. Luther goes on to reject the church's claim that the clergy is a special group in society that is higher than ordinary people in esteem and prestige, and actually closer to God because of these special powers. And you can see how this unfolds. No transubstantiation, no special powers, now no special social position for the clergy. Luther doesn't really criticize the clergy. He doesn't at all dwell on the corruptions of the clergy. He says, no, the priests of the church do a very good job. They have very important positions and very serious responsibilities. Don't forget, Luther himself was a priest. But they're just people. They're just people doing these jobs to the best of their ability. And we ought to realize that. But that's not what the church's position has always been. Then Luther does what the Pope had essentially feared but kind of goaded him into. Luther rejects the papal control over the church. He essentially says that the position of the Pope was invented during the Middle Ages, that the Pope's power to rule the church was acquired through various means, but not given by God, not declared by God. He has no divine right to rule the church. And so here, the Pope's most horrible fears are coming back to haunt him, because this is exactly what he'd feared Luther would do. The interesting thing to wonder about here is, would Luther have gone down this path about papal power had the church not sort of forced him into the admissions he made about papal power? And I really don't know what one could say about that, because whatever Luther was, he wasn't transparent, and it's not easy to look into his mind and say what he would have done or wouldn't have done. In my view, his attack on papal power here is probably a reaction to the church's position against him, but one can never be sure of such things. And finally, as a criticism of the church, Luther rejects 4 of the 7 sacraments as being channels of grace. He rejects ordination, the process by which priests and monks become official clergy. He rejects extreme unction or last rites. He rejects confirmation, and he rejects marriage. He keeps the other sacraments as channels of grace. Now, he's not saying here that we shouldn't have ordination, last rites, confirmation, marriage. All he's saying here is that when we have these ceremonies, that's all they are, is human ceremonies. They're not partially divine. They're not bringing God's grace down from heaven into people. They're not channels to get to heaven. But he's not saying they're not important to do as ceremonies in the church. So that's the major criticisms Luther makes of the church and its positions. Among his more productive or positive suggestions and ideas, I just want to mention 3. One is the idea known as the priesthood of all believers. And this actually is a very, very important idea. Luther says here that the church is wrong to claim that only the clergy and priests can read the Bible and interpret the Bible and tell us what it says and what we must believe. Luther says that, we've already pointed out, the priests and clergy are just people, and we're people. So as people, we can use our reason, we can read the Bible, we can interpret it, and we can understand what we should believe and do from that. We don't have to be priests to do it. Now, I just want to have a slight aside here and take a brief look at the church's position on Bible reading, because the medieval church had really maintained all along that ordinary people shouldn't really read the Bible, that only the church, the priests, could read the Bible and correctly interpret it and inform people of its message, because only the church had the special divine spirit given to it by Christ when Christ went into heaven after the crucifixion. So only the church has the special ability to interpret the Bible. Now, why would the church want to claim that? Well, on the one hand, interpreting the Bible is very difficult, and it's going to become more and more apparent during the Reformation how difficult it is, and so the church has something of a point. Not that they can do it better, but that it's difficult to do. A second thing is that up until, the 15th century, there was no printing press. Bibles were written out by hand, meaning they were extremely expensive, and hardly anybody could afford to have one. So most people are not going to even have a Bible. And that may be why the church is saying that people aren't obligated to read the Bible. Expensive. Nobles had Bibles as symbols of status, and they would put them on their table like a coffee table book. They didn't actually read them, but it just showed they had money because Bibles were expensive. And finally, and a kind of obvious point, the great majority of the European population was illiterate and couldn't read the Bible, even if they had one and could afford it, and they couldn't read it. So there are many reasons why the church might have taken this position on Bible reading, other than just attempting to create a kind of monopoly on divine truth, which is a more cynical way to look at it. But anyway, Luther just totally breaks with that and says we should all read the Bible. And now with the printing press, and pretty soon Luther's German translation of the Bible, it's going to be practically possible for ordinary people, or at least middle-class people, to have and read Bibles. And you probably would note here too that Luther, in advocating lay Bible reading, is following in the footsteps of the humanists who claimed that you should read the Bible, learn about the apostolic church, and you learn about Jesus, and copy the life of Christ and reform the church on the apostolic model. So, and this is one reason why humanists thought that Luther was a humanist, although he really didn't turn out to be. Secondly, Luther upholds and explains very convincingly his idea of salvation by faith alone, which we've looked at a lot already and don't need to go too much on. And then finally, Luther upholds the Bible as supreme authority in the church, over the Pope, over anybody. Now, when I said that when the Pope claimed that he was supreme over the Bible in authority, that was the first time that was ever claimed, that's certainly true. But throughout the medieval history of the church, the issue of authority in the church was kind of hazy. The church actually maintained that there were a number of authorities, the Bible being one, the Pope another, church councils another, theologians like Aquinas another, and the church just kind of left it at that there are many authorities. And no one really ever took a position on what's the highest authority. Now, the Pope had already, and now Luther does. And Luther takes the very opposite opinion, of course, a very opposite position, and says that it's the Bible and not the Pope. Okay, so once Luther publishes these works, he's made a very clear break with the church. He's also excommunicated, as you might recall, and having been excommunicated by the law of the Holy Roman Empire, he will become an outlaw, which means anybody can kill him on sight because he's outside the law. But the law also states that before you can become an outlaw, you've got to get a legal hearing. So Luther is owed a legal hearing. Usually you go to a simple court for a legal hearing like this, but Luther is too big a fish to fry in that way. And in fact, the church and the emperor decide that they will offer Luther his hearing before the imperial diet, the National Assembly of Germany, where all the various kings and princes and nobles go in attendance every year to make policy for the empire. In the year 1521, it's set for the city of Worms. So Luther will get his hearing. He's invited to this hearing, told he has a right to it. At first he refuses to go. He says, well, why should I go right into your house? Because you're probably just going to arrest me the minute I get there. And that probably was not a bad thing to think. The authorities write back and they say, we really think you should come. We really think it's important. And it's so important that what we'll do is we'll give you a free conduct. We'll give you 48 hours coming down the whole time here and 48 hours afterwards to go back when we guarantee we won't arrest you. And at that point, Luther, he basically has to agree to it. He's got no reason left not to agree to it. He's not really looking forward to having a hearing, so to speak, but he doesn't feel like he can refuse anymore. So Luther sets out for the Diet of Worms. Amazing things happen on his way there. On his way there, all along the route, people turn out from villages and towns along the side of the road and cheer him. They say, go, Luther, go. We love what you're doing. You're our hero. And Luther had never realized he was so popular. He never even realized his ideas had spread so far already. And he'd become a kind of national phenomenon. And he didn't realize it until this particular point in time. And as they cheered him and all that, it kind of increased his confidence, although he was quite surprised by it. But when he gets to Worms, events are going to unfold which really set the stage for the whole latter part of the Reformation. It's going to be a lot more than just a judicial hearing. It's going to be one of those moments in time that sets history on its course because of what one man does.